Join me over coffee as we delve into topics that affect our everyday lives. And today I'm in conversation with Rebecca Diem, and she is our current Poet Laureate. And today we're going to be talking about why it's so important to be telling our personal stories and how that affects our lives and the lives of the people who are listening to our stories. So welcome, Rebecca. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you as well.
I know that you have more to your profession than just being a poet laureate, because you're an author as well and a communication strategist, which is great. But before we get into the storytelling part, we have a lot to talk about just in terms of what is a poet laureate and how did you get there?
That's a good question, and it's one that I ask myself too sometimes. What really happened is that in 2023, I gave birth to the most beautiful little girl, and my husband and I decided that we wanted to live closer to family, and so we trekked up and decided to winter in Sauble Beach to be closer to my mom and my grandparents and all of the cousins. And we had been living in Toronto at the time. I'd been working for a literary festival. We were pretty enmeshed in our Toronto lives, or so I thought. And then something about coming back to this area, walking the shores of Sauble Beach in November with my little baby, the poetry was just inescapable, and I started working on a postpartum poetry collection. One thing led to another, and Owen was looking for a new poet laureate, and a number of friends encouraged me to apply. And so I submitted the work that I'd been doing, writing poetry about going for these walks with a, mostly sleeping baby. And the advisory committee really loved it, and they selected me as the poet laureate. So for the next 2 years, I am honored to serve my community as an advocate for the literary arts. My role as the poet laureate is really about noticing, the poetry of our everyday lives, and also showing people how to honor that poetry in their daily lives as well. At Summerfolk this past summer, I got the chance to do a reading and a Q&A and this beautiful act of collective poetry where I went around with a microphone and asked everyone to share a significant first. Because when you're a new parent, you're going through so many of those first milestones. And so we took the mic around and everyone in the audience got to share a significant first, whether it was the first time that they rode a bike or the first time that they canoed in Algonquin. And it was this beautiful act of community and collective storytelling about, things that made us feel like we could stop and take a moment to notice how special our lives are here. And, by the powers vested in me as the poet laureate, I got to dub every single one of them in that audience a poet. And that's really what I want to do with my tenure, is show people that the poetry within them is real and valid and deserves to be expressed in any way that they can.
Well, that's amazing, and it's quite a journey, I think, that we've had in our poet laureate beginnings, because I believe Liz Zetlin was the very first.
The very first.
The very first. And my very first encounter with Liz Zetlin was the random act of poetry.
Yes.
And and of course it's associated with the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library. And Tim was a guest just previously on our show over coffee. And and I'm crossing the road, and here is Liz, not knowing her at the time, was a random act of poetry and had to read poetry to me in the middle of the street. And I'm going, well, this is amazing. And her book is Roots, and I still have it. And this was many years ago.
You should get her to tell you the story sometime about the one with her gynecologist. I will never forget that story. Like, amazing. She's a legend.
So, yes. And so the previous poet laureate was Richard E. Sadowski. And Richard Eves and I had the pleasure of working together on a show here on Rogers TV called Our Story, Stories That Unite Us. And we had 29 guests who spoke for 7 minutes, a little bit more, a little bit less, on personal experience stories. And so the wealth of information and the connection, because one of the things, and we're going to get more into this, is that I feel that storytelling connects the humanity in all of us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that storytelling and being vulnerable with each other to share our personal narratives and the things that are important to us, our values, our memories, those moments, I think that that is like the purest form of connection that we have. And I think it's a really great antidote to a lot of the disconnect that, you know, in our personal lives and as a society that we've experienced, in particular since the pandemic. You know, when you think about those early days, like 4 or 5 years ago, like when we had to go into isolation to protect each other, and it was really, really difficult, and a lot of people, you know, didn't make it. And I think that as part of the collective healing that we are going through right now, there is nothing more important than sharing our stories and our experiences with each other, of reminding each other like why we live, you know. The other mug, I brought my Kegadance Press mug, but my other one, I have a vintage OSCVI mug, and the motto for the school, the old high school, was, while we live, let us live. And I really believe in that, like, especially in these days.
Well, I think at the bottom line for everyone, not only in our community, but in our country, but around the world, there's pretty much 4 things that we all want. And that is, we want safety, we want shelter, we want food and water, and we want people around us who love us and care for us. And that is a universal experience that we all strive for. Mm-hmm. And in the stories that we were hearing, that Richard and I were hearing on our program, was those were the universal themes.
Yeah.
People fleeing war-torn countries, people looking for family, people wanting a stable environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think that was a big part of what drove us to move back to Owen Sound. I grew up in Chatsworth, actually, in a little side street behind the churches, playing with all my cousins. It was very Little House on the Prairie, and it was such a warm childhood to have. And to grow up in this community. And I left for a while. I went away to university, and I lived in Toronto for a decade working. And when it came time to start our own family, there was no question in our minds. My husband's Australian, actually, and he was the one that anytime we visited home, he'd bust out the cozy sweaters and just be like, "Oh, did you see that there's a maple syrup festival up in Wyerton?" Like, you know, and he really fell in love with this community. And it felt so beautiful to introduce him to all of the things that I loved about this place. And to tell him stories about this place. Like, it was really funny to walk down the main street and be like, oh, like, this is where my friends and I would go to the bean cellar and get hot chocolates when we were in high school, and we had like a half day. You know, and like, this is where, like, I would, Phoenix Books is still there, but this is where I would, you know, buy up every like Scottish romance novel that I could get my hands on when I was like 17 and going through a phase. And it was just really beautiful to introduce him to that part of my life, to tell this man stories of like who I was as a teen, and why it felt important to, like, you know, understand that part of me in order to like love all of me. And I think that we are stories. In the same way that, you might have heard like people saying like, we are just, stardust. We are all stardust. We are all carbon atoms that have existed from the birth of the universe. And I think in the same way that we are stardust, we are stories. Like we are our memories and the memories that other people hold of us. And I think that there's something really beautiful about honoring the power of the stories that we tell about ourselves, and also the stories that we tell about our community and how they evolve over time.
Well, I think it's really important because as you were talking about telling our story, one of the things that I regret is that I didn't listen more to the stories of my grandparents' journey, World War I, World War II, or even the journey of their lives. And I didn't listen more carefully. I was a kid, wanted to go out and play. But I think telling those stories or having them recorded in some fashion, whether it's on paper or it's on video, or just an audio, how important that is for us to better understand their journey, their life, and how it affects our lives going forward.
Oh, absolutely. My grandma is one of my best friends. She was a flower girl in my wedding, which I had always dreamed of. It's just the best. And she and Grandpa just moved into town, actually, so they're just up the street, and I can visit them anytime I want and pop in and make sure they're behaving. And but no, it's a true joy to have such a close relationship with my grandparents. And like I get my creative streak from my grandmother. I was having this conversation with Jessie Wenty, actually, from Canada Council, and we were talking about the audacity of grandmothers. And the thing about my grandmother, Marilyn McComb, she's a longtime school board trustee, member.
I know, Marilyn.
Yeah, member of the Music Making Mums. Like,
she drove a blue van.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I once rented a car from the city, drove like mad on my one day off just to attend the induction ceremony for the Grey Bruce Music Hall of Fame. Okay. Stay there, watch her and her band perform, and then I had to drive like hell back to the city to get back for work the next day. Okay. And it was one of those things where I'm like, I just wanted to be there to honor that part of her story. And luckily, she and her bandmates kept journals that she won't let me see yet, which makes me very curious about what's inside. Because like they were an active band in like the 60s and 70s and 80s, 90s, 2000s. Like they were together for like 43 years, playing actively. So yeah, wow. It's a beautiful way to honor like those stories. And Grey Roots actually does a fantastic job of documenting and preserving a lot of that history. And when we were moving my grandparents from like their home of many decades into an apartment in town, the archivists at Grey Roots actually came and picked up copies of all the Music Making Mums albums and their some scrapbooks that my grandmother had made. Yeah, it was so special.
Well, now you have concrete, but it's really important, and I really encourage everyone, even though they don't think they're a storyteller, to actually pass along those stories to their children and their grandchildren. It never occurred to me that my little granddaughter, when she was about 7 or 8, she said, "Grandma, you're the storyteller in our family." And that had never occurred to me. That I just thought, my ramblings were just ramblings, and I wasn't sure they were actually listening. So.
Oh my goodness, they're always listening. My daughter is 16 months old right now, and she's just a marvel, but she's always listening. She's always watching us. She's always like picking up my husband's instruments and trying to figure out how to play them. And somehow she can already play the ukulele better than I can, which is just not fair. But no, I think it's really important to pass those histories and those legacies on, because my maternal grandparents, they passed about 10 years ago, Grandma and Grandpa Dyer, and I still hold on to those stories. We designed my engagement ring to match a necklace that I inherited from my grandmother, and found all these beautiful ways to include their memory in our ceremony and honor those stories that now I carry them in me. I think that part of the legacy that we have in this area, where so many people have such deep roots and so many people are coming into the area to put down new roots, is that sharing these stories is so important. Like talking to your neighbors, talking to your community, not just within your own family, but as a community practice. We see it with elders talking to students for different significant events like Remembrance Day, sharing these stories so that people understand the history and the context of where we live now, of why our town is the way our town is. I remember these hilarious stories of the Saints and Sinners corners and Owen Sound's rowdy past, and you look at it and you're like, okay, so on the one hand, we were this incredibly rowdy port town. And on the other hand, we were one of the last holdouts for Prohibition. And it's just, there's so many beautiful contradictions in our community that, hark back to that legacy. And I think that, young people, newcomers, whether you're, planning to be in this area forever or just want to stay a while and, enjoy the view. I think that it's so fascinating to understand the context of the area that we live, and it's so beautiful when you stop to notice it.
Well, I think the area is a draw for new people coming into our country or coming to this area. And one of the things that storytelling does, particularly for people that are of different cultures, different religions, different traditions, when we hear their stories, that brings out, something that resonates with someone who is unfamiliar with that culture, unfamiliar with that tradition, or even unfamiliar with that language. But I think basically when we hear a story from someone who is new to our community or new to our country and bring their culture with them, that it's really important that we hear their story, because we are also then hearing the similarities, the feelings. I have that feeling. I understand loneliness. I understand love. I understand being afraid. I understand taking risks. So you're hearing that story from someone from a different culture, and you're having that same emotional attachment. And we're really hoping to break down barriers by storytelling, listening particularly to people who have a different story to tell.
Yeah. I think that one of the ways that I've been working to break down those barriers in my personal life is reading more Indigenous books.
Oh, yes.
Wabgijig Rice is one of my favorite authors. Moon of the Crested Snow is fantastic. Cherie Dimaline, Empire of Wild. There's a part in the book where, she's playing euchre around the kitchen table with her grandmother. And it's set around Georgian Bay, and I had never seen my community reflected like that in a kind of a speculative fiction story. I'd never seen a landscape described where I could smell the air and remember what it was like to play euchre up in Lion's Head with my uncles and my parents, and it felt like I'd been missing part of the story of our home by not having access to the wealth of Indigenous literature that we are now being blessed by, thanks to presses like Kegadance and so many other storytellers. And the major publishers are finally picking up on that. But it's so curious because a lot of the stories that are being highlighted right now are still stories of the trauma of the residential school system, of the pain. And the thing is that my daughter has a little bestie who was born 10 days after her, who's from the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation, named Carmen. And the thing is that a lot of these stories don't capture the joy, the joy of going to like a birthday party, and there's corn soup and also a piñata because his mom's Mexican, and we have a little Australian Canadian baby. And there's what I want is more stories about joy. Like we have a lot of stories about the trauma and the pain that connects us, and those are incredibly important stories to share. Incredibly important stories to share and truths that need to be told. Yes. But the next step beyond that, I think, is the stories of our joy, and the joy that connects us, the resilience that connects us, the hopes that we share, the optimism that we shared, and the fact that regardless of what's going on in our individual lives, like people have inhabited this area for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And these are resilient communities who have survived horrors and also celebrated joys together. And that's our community. That's the story that we are part of and that we get to play a role in telling.
Well, I think it's important that we acknowledge all of it. All the good, the bad, the ugly, the trauma, and the joy. The joy. And I think that it's really important that one of the comments, so we have these lovely books sitting here. We do have to address them. But when you were talking about hope and joy, your books are described as hopeful, speculative stories. And I don't know what that means. So, but you are an author, and this is your series.
Yes. So about 10 years ago, I published my first book, The Stowaway Debutante. And it was a series about airship pirates. It's about a girl who runs away from her engagement party, stows away aboard an airship filled with gunpowder, and when pirates attack, she saves their lives from certain peril and talks her way into joining the crew, the legendary Captain Duke. And that's chapter 1.
Okay, so this is the hopeful. Now, what's the speculative part?
The speculative is that it's kind of a Victorian science fantasy. So it's set in an alternate universe where in the Victorian era, Queen Victoria passed some policies that accidentally, created gender equality a few decades before it happened. And with the explosion of female academics in this imagined society, they developed lighter than air technology, a number of steampunk innovations, which is like Victorian science fiction, and some disruptive technologies that allowed for vast economic growth thanks to drawing on the wealth of female scholarship that they suddenly had access to.
Wow, that is a lot packed into that book.
It is, but it's just a fun romp at the same time. So,
that's wonderful, because we've really covered storytelling is poetry, storytelling is music, storytelling is the written work in books or in essays, that sort of thing. So I have a couple of quotes here. This is my thing, is quotes. Storytelling is one of the pillars of building a meaningful life. And that is by not only telling your story, but listening to others. And the other is listening to others helps us tell our own story in new ways. So we get to hear a story and digest it and then make it relatable to ourselves. Well, I can tell my story in that way. And I hadn't thought of that before. And of course, for me, it's always bringing out the humanity in all of us and understanding what other people are going through.
I'm seeing a theme with all of your series. It's really beautiful.
Well, I think I am so fascinated by other people's stories. I think that I learn something new every single time. I enjoy the fact that they are vulnerable and that they will share that story. And always grateful for their ability to kind of sit down and I will tell my story, even though it's hard for me to tell it, or it's a story I want to tell over and over again because it's so joyful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. One of the things that was really remarkable in the last year is that, I mean, previously, like I really focused on science fiction and fantasy, like the speculative fiction aspect of my creativity, and I'd done some poetry, but I hadn't shared that much of it because it felt so vulnerable. Oh. And after giving birth and connecting with so many other new parents and hearing their stories, that's when I started writing the poems that are, you know, becoming this new collection. And it was through going to like the library songs, like the library hosts a baby time every week, and they play songs and they, you know, put up the bubble machine, the babies dance around, and you know, they'll read a story, and we're all there in community together watching our babies grow. And you're not just there as, you know, yourself and watching your own baby, you're watching everyone else's babies grow up together too. You're watching people handle like a toddler and a newborn at the same time, and you're lending a hand when you can. And there was something about the community that I found going to these parent groups in Owen Sound that made me feel connected to this area in a way that was so deep and meaningful, and that I hadn't been able to access before. And somehow, like between that and the Poet Laureateship and having to do all of these readings where suddenly I'm up on stage talking about getting the adhesive off my body, like post giving birth, and the magic of witch hazel and all of these things, it felt so vulnerable and scary until I spoke them aloud and had all of these people come up to me afterwards, all of these mothers and parents say, I remember that, and thank you for noticing it. And it was so important to speak those experiences aloud because, you know, I think that when they're hidden, you can feel so isolated, and so much of, you know, the first year of parenthood is isolating.
That's wonderful, and I'm getting the cue that we're coming to the end, and I am so grateful to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you about the important topic of telling your story. And join me next time over coffee.
This program is brought to you by Rogers Xfinity, connecting you to more of what you love. Visit Rogers.com for more details. Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
Looking for more substance than just flavor?
I'm all in.
Food Network has all new knockout dishes.
Wham!
All new culinary competitions.
I don't like this. I love it.
And all new epic rivalries.
These two want to beat each other so bad.
With all new seasons of your Food Network favorites.
Let's light this place up!
Do it like this. There's nothing else like it.
Yeah, that was good.
Food Network. Get the latest on Rogers Xfinity.
Are you a passionate content creator ready to expand your audience?